Hi, my name is Morris Franco. This is part 2 of my 7th video on the national debt crisis. In this video, I try to explain why my predictions of higher interest rates, among other things, hasn't happened, picking up where I left off, discussing the mindset of the investor. I think this is the most difficult area to address, because ultimately it is the investor who has the final say on what interest rates they will accept before purchasing U.S. debt. I believe the statement is logical. However, in my opinion, bond investors are acting like a bunch of lemmings. They act as if they are totally ignorant of the poor financial condition of the country and accept the ratings the credit agencies issue as the gospel. They also accept whatever interest rates the Federal Reserve deems appropriate to current economic conditions, rarely buying or selling treasuries more than half a point away from the Fed's benchmark rates. You would expect the investor to assess the creditworthiness of the entity he's investing in and then demand whatever interest rate is appropriate to the riskiness of the security. So much for logic. In January of 2000, the 10-year Treasury yielded 6.6% and the national debt was under $6 trillion. Today, the national debt has more than tripled to $18.2 trillion and the 10-year bond is under 2%. What's wrong with this picture? I previously stated that the slogan, "Don't fight the Fed," was doomed to go down in flames as investors wake up to the weak financial conditions of this country. I may have to rethink that opinion. If memory serves me correctly, prior to the Ben Bernanke era, the Federal Reserve usually kept its opinion on where rates should be to itself. The only time rate moves were predictable was when the economy was in a major expansion or recession. The rest of the time, rate change announcements would be done without warning. When Bernanke took over, he changed Fed policy and started issuing status report type statements of when federal rate changes would occur. Prior to the Bernanke era, both bond traders and the Fed moved interest rates around. It was not uncommon for the Fed to move their benchmark rate just to bring them in line with the current market, because bond traders had different ideas on where interest rates should be. As I just stated, bond investors seem reluctant to challenge the Fed and are willing to accept whatever rate the Fed deems appropriate. The massive bond buying program in recent years punished investors who thought rates were too low given the country's deteriorating financial condition. The investor, as well as the general public, remain oblivious to the growth of the national debt. Whether the debt is $3 trillion or $30 trillion, most citizens care very little about it. Only conservatives, myself included, believe this is a serious problem. The only thing that's going to wake up the general public is the huge interest expense that will come from the continuing growth of the debt, rising interest rates, and or downgrade by the major credit agencies. Apparently, investors don't care that the United States is up to its eyeballs in debt. It won't be too long before debt interest exceeds $1 trillion annually. Let's go back to 1995 when the national debt was under $6 trillion. That same year, interest paid on the debt was $330 billion. Now the national debt is tripled to $18 trillion. If interest rates were the same today as they were in 1995, the interest rate on the current debt would be about $1 trillion. The Cato Institute put the amount of debt interest in 2014 at only $229 billion. This low amount is because current interest rates are less than 25% of what they were in 1995. Here I have to repeat a very important paragraph from my book. This was written in 2013. The paragraph is entitled, "Growing the Debt Without Pain." The national debt grew by about 70% to almost 17 trillion by 2013 from about 10 trillion in 2008. The Fed's low interest rate policy was in effect throughout the period, Yet the amount of debt interest paid barely budged from year to year. This was made possible by the fact that debt issued prior to the Fed's low interest rate yielded higher rates, and upon maturity were rolled over at the current low rates. This had the effect of keeping the growth of the national debt out of the public eye, as the government was able to increase the size of the national debt massively without having to increase a comparable amount of debt interest. End of quote. Discussing the Federal Reserve. If the U.S. government needed to raise $180 billion to fund some government project, it would take an income hike of about $750 from every working American. However, the Fed can raise that amount from taxpayers just by increasing interest rates by 1 percentage point. $180 billion is 1% of the $18 trillion national debt. In 2007, when the Fed first began its low-rate accommodative policy, the national debt was less than $10 trillion. A 1% rate increase would have cost $100 billion. In other words, it now costs 80% more to fund the national debt than it did when the Fed first started its low-rate policy. As I just pointed out, the amount of interest on the national debt in 2014 was $229 billion. That equates to an overall interest rate on the entire debt of just about 1.3%. The government website, U.S. Treasury Direct, estimates the 2015 budget deficit at $564 billion, even with these record low interest rates. I say this because, just like the credit agencies, the Federal Reserve is under tremendous amount of pressure. The government puts pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep rates low because it's politically beneficial, as low rates help the economy. It is likely that President Obama made his position on rates clear to Janet Yellen before appointing her as the head of the Federal Reserve. A second and more important point is the impact the growth of the debt will have when interest rates are raised. The pressure on the Fed is the $180 billion it will cost taxpayers for each 1 point increase in interest rates. If the Fed wanted to normalize rates and raise it 4 points from 1.3 to 5.3%, that 4% increase in rates will cost taxpayers an additional mind-blowing $720 billion. Note, the average rate over the last 50 years was at least 6%. If that 4% jump in rates were to happen in 2016, it would blow up the budget and increase the budget deficit to over $1.2 trillion. Of course, that much of a rate hike would have to be spread over 3 or 4 years. Unfortunately, we will need to add budget deficits from each of those 3 or 4 years onto the national debt. Budget deficits will exceed $1 trillion. Budget deficits in excess of $1 trillion will be the norm by then. So you can see the potential havoc it will have on taxpayers and the economy, and why the Fed would, if it could, keep rates as low as possible. The normal interest rate of 5% had a purpose. At 5%, the Fed had room to maneuver because when recessionary pressure became apparent, the reduction in rates would serve as a valuable stimulus. At 1.3%, the Fed has no room to maneuver. Bear in mind, when overall rate is that low, short-term rates are already at zero. The rapid growth in the national debt is another problem. It severely hampers the Fed's ability to fight inflation. When Paul Volcker led the Fed, he was faced with runaway inflation due to the worldwide oil shortage. He pushed interest rates to an average of 13% from 1980 through 1982. At the time, the national debt was just over $1 trillion. Now, with an $18 trillion debt interest alone would add another $500 billion to the budget each of those 3 years. Another small part the Fed plays in keeping interest rates down is the bonds they accumulated as part of the quantitative easing programs. They bought up over $4 trillion in bonds, $2.4 trillion in treasuries, the rest in mortgage-backed securities. It is likely that if the market had to absorb these $4 trillion in bonds, interest rates might be a little higher. I want to talk a little bit about Janet Yellen, head of Reserve. A few words about Janet Yellen, chairman of the Federal Reserve. I know nothing about her personal life and have no reason to think she's anything other than a fine person. I also believe she's eminently qualified to head the Federal Reserve. My concern is that she may be reluctant to raise rates for political reasons. Please don't give much weight to this analysis because I'm well aware my evidence is scant. But nevertheless, it may be a factor in why the Fed keeps rates so low for so long. On November 6, Janet Yellen, who was then head of the San Francisco branch of the Federal Reserve, spoke at the University of California, Irvine on the subject of economic inequality. I will read what she said, but I must say up front that the subject matter all by itself shows Mrs. Yellen's political bias. I believe none of President Obama's appointees are allowed opinions that differ from his opinions. I may be a little naive on this subject, but I believe presidential appointees should be given to people best qualified to fill the position regardless of race or gender. President Obama's method of appointing people is based on who is best qualified to carry out his political agenda without question. The term economic inequality has its own liberal connotations. There is no area where human interaction is involved that doesn't have some form of inequality, whether it be racial, wages, education, or any other area of human involvement. These charges of inequality is nothing more than liberal propaganda designed to appeal to every man's concern that total fairness is not present everywhere. As long as politicians can promote this mindset, liberalism will succeed. If the time, effort, and cost were applied to building things up instead of tearing them down, all of us would be better off, creating programs that will bring prosperity rather than creating work for lawyers. Let us look at what a great nation America has become because of capitalism and think about how much inequality there is in this country compared to the rest of the world with their other forms of government. My point here is we need to ensure that our capitalist form of government succeeds in order that all our freedoms can exist, even if they are not 100% equitable. It's a question of assigning priorities. However, when truly egregious inequality exists, it should be vigorously addressed. There is no sure method of preventing inequality, and some will always exist, no matter how much money and effort is used to prevent it. There is as much of a chance of ending economic inequality as there is of ending crime. Even pure socialist or communist governments cannot achieve economic equality. Ms. Yellen's comments on this subject, and it's titled, "What Explains the Rising Economic Inequality?" This is sort of a tongue twister. And she said, although there are a variety of ways to explain trends in wage inequality, perhaps no cut at the data has been more revealing than the differences in real wages by education. As Figure 2 shows, since the early 1980s, the wage gap between college graduates and those with high school education or less has widened dramatically. The gap between high school graduates and non-graduates has also widened, but less so. Thus, it appears that the demand for college-educated workers has outstripped the supply. While rising returns to education at the upper end of the distribution led to a pickup in college enrollment, the increase in supply has not been sufficient to reduce the wage gap between college and high school educated workers. It is important to recognize, however, that shifts in the return to education and the educational attainment of the workforce cannot fully explain the evolution of inequality over the last 30 years because even with groups within the same level of education, the gap between high and low earners has widened too. Indeed, the more advanced the degree, the wider the gap becomes. A satisfactory theory must therefore explain not only why the demand for college-educated workers has risen, but also why residual inequality has increased. That is, the part that is unexplained by education and other observable factors. End of quote. Economics pundits call this Fed speak, the way economists talk. This is only my opinion, but I think the statement is pure double talk. It sounds to me as if she's saying there's something inequitable in the differences in earned income based on levels of education, and that for some reason the gap has not remained consistent, or maybe I'm just incapable of understanding her point. In any case, this is a social issue and not in the purview of the Federal Reserve. In recent times, she had raised the issue of income inequality, another social issue, and showing what I believe is a liberal bias. The Federal Reserve's chairmanship is more than just a cabinet position. The Federal Reserve is an independent agency responsible for fighting inflation while targeting full employment. Many times the Fed will be required to adjust interest rates in a manner that is contrary to the political goals of Congress and the President. Its independence is essential in order for it to perform its function. I personally have a lot of problems with liberalism. However, I respect every citizen's right to choose any political philosophy. My concern here is that a loyalty to the President may wrongly influence her judgment. President Obama. President Obama campaigned on a promise to fundamentally change America. I don't know if growing the national debt was intentional on his part, but if the national debt crisis blew up during his presidency, and heaven forbid his control of Congress, just think of what an opportunity would have been for him to remake America as he thinks it should be. The president and his appointees live by the motto, never waste a crisis. And if the national debt crisis blew up, the president would have a field day. There is no question in my mind that the president will do almost anything to help him achieve his ultra-liberal philosophy, as was demonstrated by the 20-plus times he admittedly lied about Obamacare. E.g., you can keep your insurance, your doctor, and save $2,500. He made these statements with the conviction of the Pope and is on record as lying numerous times on other issues. On January 3rd of 2008, when candidate Obama was campaigning for president, he made the following statements with regard to the national debt. I think he made these statements in the Senate chambers. It appears he's lost without a teleprompter. He speaks worse than I do. Here's his statement in quotes. The problem is the way Bush has done it over the last 8 years is to take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt from $5 trillion for the first 42 presidents. Number 43 added $4 trillion by his lonesome. So we now have over $9 trillion of debt we are going to have to pay back. $30,000 for every man, woman, and child. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic. End quote. In my opinion, President Obama stole the election for his second term as president. Had he told the truth about Obamacare, he never would have been reelected. He now abuses his power and uses executive action to change laws, create new laws, or completely disregard laws in order to achieve his ultra-liberal political agenda. The national debt problem is out of control, and I don't think we can look to President Obama for any help in this area. Remember his comment after the S&P downgrade in August of 2011, quote, "But here's the good news. Our problems are eminently solvable, and we know what we have to do to solve them," end quote. He wouldn't lie about this, would he? Anyway, that's the end of my analysis. Hope you found it interesting and informative, and please watch the rest of the videos. Thank you.